Carolyn from Crochelina.com, and I've got an exciting new episode for you today because I'm going to be doing a sneak peek of my first two patterns that I'm posting in my shop, this hat pattern and this backpack pattern. In my last video tutorial, I showed you 3 of my go-to flowers, how I did it step by step, and after that I realized there's so much you can do with flowers besides just 2D embellishment. So I'm creating a collection of flower inspired patterns that use flowers to create all sorts of different shapes and bouquets, table runners, this kind of thing. So these are the first 2 that I come up with. So here's a little background about how I got to picking these patterns, how I created them. I had a friend who had a daughter with an afro, and she needed like a poofy, fun hat for her kid that would contain the afro. And then after a while, the afro got too big and she grew out of it, and she was so sad because she loved the hat. So I said, okay, give it to me. I'll turn it into something else, and that's when I turned it into the backpack. And I love the backpack so much. It's great, it's colorful, and I love that she loves it. She takes it to school, so that was great. So what do I mean by a pattern sneak peek? Well, I want to give you the confidence you need to know that when you're buying this pattern, yes, I can tackle this. This is a great pattern. I'm excited. I'm going to show you the steps of how I created the hat and how I created the backpack. I'm going to show you, for example, how I joined my flowers to create my flat flower piece, and how I turned that into a semi-sphere to create the top of the hat and the bottom of the backpack. How I line the hat, because not all crocheters are sewers, so I think it's something useful to learn. So I'll show you how I hand stitched in the lining, and as well how I did the lining for the backpack, how I did the straps for the backpack and buttons, like where I sew them in, and how I did my bead kind of fastener. So I'm going to show you how I do all these steps. So let's do it. So the hat and backpack pattern use 6 different colors of yarn, a cream for the center of the flowers, and then 5 coordinating colors, and a 5mm hook. These are all about 4-ply, some are a little bit thicker, 3-ply. So these are not all the same brands. I just went to a craft store and found colors that I really liked that looked nice together and were good quality. The first thing I do when I start this pattern is make all of the circles that I need for my large flowers. So I look at the pattern, I count how many flowers I'm going to do for the large flowers, and I just make the circles, cut them, and put them aside so they're ready. Also in my pattern, I tell you how much yarn you need for each flower for the center part, so you can just cut all of the strips of yarn and just do them quickly. And for the petals of each flower, I tell you how much yarn you need for the large flower petals and for the smaller flowers. So then, after I finish all of these, I get a measuring tape and I measure out how much I wrote in the pattern, and I cut them all, and then I set them aside, and then one by one I'll do each of the flowers. So here I've got my almost finished flat sections of flowers that I've weaved together. You can see they're interlinked. That's how the flowers are connected. And I'm going to show you how I connect a flower, just so you can see how easy it is. And I'm going to connect it right here. And the flower is going to be turquoise, and it's going to connect between this large flower, this little flower, this large flower, and this little flower together. And again, in my pattern, I've got a symbol pattern that is color mapped so that you know exactly where to connect and which colors to use for each of the flowers. So here's the flower that I've started, and I'm going to connect to these 4 flowers. And my trick is that I start by counting how many flowers that need to be connected, and then I times it by 2 because I'm going to connect to 2 petals each. So here's 2, 2, 2, and 2. So it's 4. So since I have 16 petals on the large flowers, I do 8, and then I'm ready to start connecting my flowers. So first I count over, we're going counterclockwise. So I start with this one. All I do is I take it off my hook, and I just push the loop through and put my hook back on, and then slip stitch into the next stitch, and I've connected 1 petal. Now I'm going to do it again. So I'll do my chain, okay, and I took it off, and I'm going to connect to the next petal, and then I'm going to slip stitch, and that's the second one connected. Now I'm going to connect to these 2, so I'll start my next chain, and I'm going to slip it through and then slip stitch, and I've done that petal. Now if you had not pre-cut the turquoise, then you can see that the yarn string is going through all of the petals, and it's going to start getting annoying to pull through. So that's why I pre-cut it, so that I can just pull it through like this. And there's my end. So I can keep going. And do the next petal. As you can see, it's really simple, it's repetitive. The only thing you have to watch out for is, are you connecting to the right flowers? Have you connected to enough of the petals? Make sure you connect to 2 and not just 1. You're going to do this all the way around. So now I've done my last petal, and I'm just going to slip stitch into the first chain area, and I'll show you what it looks like. I have connected the flower. It's that simple. Now I'm going to show you what I do with my ends. So obviously if you have a lot of flowers, a lot of different colors, you're going to wind up with a lot of ends. And don't think, oh, I'll just connect them in the back. That is going to look messy because there are gaps in between, and you'll see just strings going back and forth. So what I like to do is tie knots and cut them pretty short. And make sure you tie your knots tight and you pull all your ends so that it doesn't wiggle out. I think that this is the fastest way to do it if you do not want to sew in your ends. Because let's just be real now. That's a lot of ends to sew in. And if it's going to turn into a hat or a backpack and you're going to be putting a lining on it, you're not going to see them. A lot of times when you sew in your ends, if you don't sew them in very well, you just lightly sew them in, or you work over your ends, they'll pop out, and that'll be annoying for someone if this is a gift. So I just prefer to tie knots and then just cut them just like that. Now here's a tip for the order to attach the flowers in. So I always like to start at the top. And I will just start, if I started with this one, I will attach the large flower to it, and then the next large flower to that. So I will go row by row by row. So first I'll do the large flowers, and then I'll start at this side again, and then connect the small flowers, and then I'll start on this side and connect the large flowers. Now that I've finished connecting all of my flowers, the question is, how does this turn into a hat or a backpack, right? So I'm going to show you just how it's done. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to attach my next color into one of the petals. And then I am going to single crochet in each petal all the way across. And what I mean by that is that every petal which is not connected is going to get a single crochet. So this one, this one, this one, this one. And you're going to want it to be fairly consistent and tight. You don't want them too loose. So keep your tension, because that's what's going to curve it. So I'm just going to speed this up so you can see what I'm doing. Now I've gotten to my first stitch, and I'm just going to slip stitch with the first single crochet and my round, and now I've turned the flower into a new round base of stitches that we can work into to make the hat or the backpack. So here's the hat, and I'm going to show you how to line the hat. And this is not an exact science, like doing a beanie, for example, is a lot easier because it's just an arch. And because this is kind of like a sphere, you've got some stretch where the flowers are overlapping when they're flat, so you have to make your lining a little bit bigger at the part where it's stretched and smaller where it's not stretched, like at the height. So this is how I would do it. So you want at least like a quarter of an inch for overlap. I'm going to give it about a half on the top because it is not stretching at all on the top. That is the maximum height. So something like this. And then as I go down, I'm going to make it a little wider until you get about, 1.5 inches, because we're going to make up for this overlap here. And then when we get down to the bottom, I'm going to let it curve back a little bit. And then back. Now it's always better to have more than less, because if it's too big, then you just sew it in a little bit more and cut it. So what I have here is I've got fleece on the bottom, and you want to try and put your hat in the orientation where it's stretchy. So if I'm trying to stretch it this way, this is the stretchy part. This is not as stretchy, because that's where it's going to go around your head. So you want it to be able to stretch. Also, I've got 2 layers, one for the top, one for the bottom, and I'm going to be sewing around the part where I've cut out. So I'm going to cut out around this blue marker, and then I'm going to sew them together. You can use like an instant fabric glue, where you just lay the glue down on the edge and then put them on top of each other, and then it'll kind of fuse the fabric together. As I said, I've got 2 layers, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to sew this part all the way around to here, and I'm not going to sew the bottom part, because then that's what's going to go inside the hat, and it's got to be open for us to sew to the inside of our hat. So here it is, and I've just used my machine to sew around the outside, but it is completely unnecessary. You can just sew like this all the way around, or just hand sew, or use the liquid glue, it doesn't matter. And now let's try it out. You're just going to stuff it into your hat. So here I'm stitching my hat. I'm stitching the liner in, the one I just cut. And I find it very helpful to put in 4 pins just to hold the liner in place evenly around. And I'm going to show you just how I stitch it. It's very easy. You just have a needle and thread, and I like to pick a color that's close to the one on the brim. So I just do this, where I put it through my fleece and then through a little back loop of a stitch. Line it up a little bit and do this all the way around. And sometimes if you have like a large bump somewhere, you just have to stretch your crochet a little bit and then stitch, and that'll compress with the crochet. Again, it's liner, you're not going to see it, but you don't have to do the stitching too tight. But that's how I stitch my lining to my hats. So I've finished doing everything except the outer single crochet around the flap of my backpack. So I just wanted to show you how I do stitches into the side of stitches, because I think that's something that is a little tricky first time you do it. So what I do, it is not an exact science. Since these are half double crochet and their height is 1 or 2 chains, so I'll either go once or twice into each stitch, in the side of each stitch. So sometimes I'll just poke it in, or you could go, you know, in between the stitches. You could even go around an entire stitch, but then if you do that, you kind of wind up with a little hole. So I try to go into at least 1 loop or 2 loops of a stitch. Now I'm going to show you how to deal with the back straps. So I've already done one side. I've sewed it, one of the long strap on this side, I've sewed a short strap on this side, and I've sewed on buttons. So this is what the long strap looks like, and it's sewn like this, and then I just attach the buttons on the end, and then I'm going to show you how to sew on the short one. And I've got two ends on one side which are long for sewing, and then I put my buttons on this side. And first of all, how to choose the proper size button. Well, I've got two different sizes here. I've got a pink one and a white one, and you want to pick the biggest button that could fit into your holes so that it doesn't just come loose. So since my white button can fit through the stitches, that's the one I want to use. I don't want to go with a smaller pink one because you risk them just popping off, and if you have anything heavy in a backpack, you do not want that. So I'm going to stick with my white ones, and I'll show you first how I sew in my buttons, and then I'll sew it to the backpack. So first of all, I use a needle that is blunt on the end and small enough that it can fit through the holes. I have other needles that are a little bit wider that I use usually for sewing in ends, but they don't work because they don't fit through the hole. So you need to make sure you have something like that. Then I put one on one side and leave a little bit of a tail and just go crisscross. This might be basic, but you know, not everyone who crochets sews, so it's just something which is good to know, how to sew on a button. So I've done crisscross twice, and I think that's enough to make it secure. Now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to move my thread through the stitches to the middle of the other side, just like this, and then poke it through so that I can put on my second button. And I'll just hold it in place so it doesn't shift too much. And now for the back, what I like to do is I'll bring the ends next to each other like this, and then I will tie a knot just to double secure them because there's a lot of stress on the buttons. And you don't want them to wiggle out. So just tie one knot, and then I'll just string them both into my needle. Like this. And then I will just kind of sew in the end in the back so you don't see it. And you've got the buttons. Now, how to sew in the strap into the backpack. So where I attach this is on top of one of the flowers. I mean, you need kind of a sturdy spot, so I did it in the middle part of one of my large flowers, which I'm going to do the same thing here on this yellow flower. And I'm just going to turn it like this and use this side, for example. Use my needle, and what you're going to have to do is stick one hand into the backpack to hold it up so that you don't wind up sewing into one of the back stitches and getting it stuck. So I'm just going to put it like this, and because I'm lining it, it doesn't matter that I'm just going in and out. I don't have to be too careful about my stitches. And I'm basically doing maybe about 3 stitches, like this wide. That's as far as I'm going to sew. Now I'm going to get this other end. I've got a knot on this end. Cut that off. Don't need all of that. So then I will just sew on the backpack strap with this end as well. And I'll do the same thing as I did with the button, where I will do a knot with both ends just to keep it secure, because again there's going to be a lot of stress on the straps and you want to make sure that it is secure. But let's say I've finished here and they're close to each other. I'm just going to tie, knot, and then you can just cut it. Since we're doing lining, you don't have to sew it in. You could sew it in if you wanted. And that's how you do the strap. Okay, so how do the buttons attach? I have 2 buttons on the bottom, which is a shorter strap, and I've got 2 on the top. And so, you know, for the lowest setting, I will just get my top buttons and tuck them in between the lower strap stitches. And then I'll take the bottom strap and tuck it behind the top. This way it's fully adjustable. If you need it to be longer, then you just move it to where you need it. And there you go, the straps are done. So I'm going to show you how to sew on this wooden bead that I'm using for my fastener. I already have the chain up here from doing single crochet all the way around and then doing a chain 4 and then continuing single crochet all the way around. And what I've done is I've laid out my backpack flat and I've counted, you know, till I got to the center, and I found my 2 stitches that I'm going to use to sew my button to. You want to be able to push your chain through fairly easily, and because we didn't sew our bead to these stitches, outer stitches, you're actually able to have it hook kind of under it, and that's how you do it. So now for the lining. What I've done is I got some fabric and I've folded it over in half, and one side goes up to about 1/2 inch higher than this inner flap, and the other side is about 1/2 inch larger than the outer flap. And I folded it over and I cut with a rather large kind of gap around, especially the flower part, because it stretches and it poofs, so you need to make up for the poof. You don't want to have a smaller inner lining than your crochet. So I have, you know, especially a wider cutout here all the way around my backpack. And there are 2 ways you can do this. You can either sew it with sew both flaps together from here all the way around to the flap on the other side, or you can use this super fabric adhesive. So I'm going to sew it, and I will show you what it looks like. So I've got this sewn all the way around up until I get to this flap. And you can either, to make it more sturdy, you can zigzag stitch around if you have a zigzag machine, or just like whip stitch, hand stitch all the way around. If you use the fabric fuser, then you don't have to, because it's fine. This is not an art, no one's going to see it, it's in the inside. It's really just to keep things from falling out when you put stuff in the bag. So then what you can do is you can cut a little bit closer, so you don't have as much of a wide outer part, and then you can stick it in the bag. And I'll show you how to hand sew this part, because you do have to sew this part by hand. So I've put my liner into the backpack, and you can see I've got my rough edges on the outside. So the long end is where my long flap is. So all I'm going to do now is I'm just going to fold it over a little bit, and I'll start at the corner, for example. So I'll align the corner, give myself a little bit extra, and just fold it over and pin it so that it's easier to sew. Don't have to put so many pins, just enough to keep it in place so it doesn't move around. And because crochet is stretchy, give it a little bit of leeway. So I like to do the corners first. And then I'll do probably 2 in the middle. So here's 1. And if you have any ends, like this, I have an end here, you just push it down, you'll sew over it so you won't see it. And by folding it over, you're going to sew over the raw edge, and you'll give it a nicer finish. So I have a needle that has a sharp end because it's going to go through the fabric, and a coordinating color, so something that's not really going to show. And just like with the hat lining, you just want to pick up a little bit of a stitch. So that's what it should look like, how it should be sewn. I hope you enjoyed this video sneak peek of my 2 newest patterns, and I hope it gave you some confidence and excitement. And if you're ready to try it out, I have the link below, which will take you to my shop where you can either get the hat pattern or the backpack pattern, or both for a discounted price. And I'd love for you to send me pictures of what you create, and I can repost them on my blog. In my next video tutorial, I'm going to teach you how to read symbol patterns. So not just written word patterns in crochet, how to read the diagrams. So even if a pattern isn't in English, you know how to do it. I think it's very important. So we'll go through that next time. So don't miss it. Subscribe, and if you like this video, give me a thumbs up, and I'll see you next time.